What if our theology could get up out of our armchairs and into the real world?
That would be something worth talking about.
This is the Armchair Anabaptist Podcast.
The early Anabaptists were known for writing tons of songs about their faith. There was a kind of a joy about this, actually. And I think Mennonites in subsequent years maybe had a little bit of trouble keeping those two together.
In one sense, you can understand that they would want to be free from the influences of the world and not fall back into some of the problems of life in Russia. But on the other hand, they had forgotten the Great Commission.
When times are good and easy and comfortable, then that complacency often comes at the expense of a fire and a passion for our faith and for living in a grateful obedience to what God has done for us.
It's just becoming really, really difficult to maintain this kind of white-hot Anabaptist discipleship fire.
Evangelicalism was, what is the church about? What's it for, rather than what's it against?
Hello and welcome. I'm Geraldine Witchers here with Andrew Dick and Jesse Penner. This is episode 4 of the Armchair Anabaptist, The Splinter Cell. In the last episode, we talked with Darryl, Klassen, and Layton, Friesen about the early ideas that shaped the Anabaptist movement and how Mennonites thought about faith and works. We also met some guys with some really cool names like Balthazar Hubmeier and Pilgrim Marpeck. Those are free pet names for next time you need one. Today we're going to move forward by a few hundred years to talk about our own little branch of the Mennonite tradition, the Kleine Gemeinde. You'll hear from the same guests as last episode. We have Darryl Klassen, adjunct professor of Anabaptist history at Steinbach Bible College, and Layton Friesen, the academic dean at SBC. Last episode, Darryl began to get into how the Kleine Gemeinde under leader Klaus Reimer emerged from what they saw as a spiritually stagnant Große Gemeinde. My question to Layton was, how did the Kleine Gemeinde's idea of Christian practice differ from the main Mennonite church? Layton set his answer in the context of early 19th century Russia, where the Mennonites had settled into colonies. They were finally being left alone to live as they pleased, and they were feeling a bit less pressure from the outside world.
So they didn't have this pressure from the world, so to speak, to stand up for what they believed and live differently and advocate for themselves. And so it was very easy for them to become kind of complacent in their Christian lives because they lived fairly safe lives. They were enclosed in these colonies. They lived in places where everybody around them was a Mennonite. So it just became it became easy to forget the kind of existential difficulty of being a Christian that would have been part of the 16th century Anabaptist experience. They had, I guess, kind of made a system out of it. They had figured out a way to pass on the faith from generation to generation without a whole lot of struggle and without a whole lot of these kind of torturous conversion experiences, without this sense of kind of being buried with Christ. I mean, it really became a matter of kind of passing the faith on to the next generation, and they would accept it and grow up to be Mennonites and so on. And so as that developed in the colonies in Russia, the ministers in the churches just noticed the decline in morals. They noticed that the people just weren't as sincere about their faith. There was a fair bit of violence going on in the colonies. There was a lot of other immorality going on, and all the ministers were disturbed by this. And it's very interesting to read journals from the 19th century written by pastors who talk about their worries and their stresses as pastors as they're trying to disciple and kind of shepherd these congregations where there is so much drunkenness, immorality going on, stealing, conflict between people, mistreatment of workers, and so on. And it's just becoming really, really difficult to maintain this kind of white-hot Anabaptist discipleship fire, so to speak. These people they recall these days. I mean, it's not like they're reading a lot of Anabaptist theology from the 16th century, but many of these ministers would probably have a copy of the Martyr's Mirror, which would have told them about this. Some of them might have read Men of Simons, and they might have had some other devotional writers. And so, by the beginning of the 19th century, there's a fair bit of energy, I guess, in terms of renewal.
Layton added that the Kleine Gemeinde were known to be so serious about Christian practice that they were almost austere or even severe, to the point of joylessness. I think this gives us some insight into how that group of believers struggled to balance faith and works.
It really does come back to this question of faith and works. Like, can you have a strong emphasis on morality, on ethics, on obedience, on following Jesus? Can you have that in a way that's dependent on the Holy Spirit, that's patient, that's kind, that's full of joy, rather than guilt? I mean, is it possible to have that kind of faith? I think that's the vision of Anabaptism from the beginning, is that this can be a joy that breeds a lot of singing, actually. Like, the early Anabaptists were known for writing tons of songs about their faith. There was a kind of a joy about this, actually. And I think Mennonites in subsequent years maybe had a little bit of trouble keeping those two together. You could have outbreaks of joy and renewal and excitement and emotion, or you could have outbreaks of morality and obedience and suffering and discipleship. But what was challenging was bringing those two together, and maybe we're still looking for that even today.
We see in the Mennonites this common pattern where they lose some of that outside pressure, and then that leads to complacency and decline, which in some ways is a very modern sort of problem. I mean, maybe you can be able to see some parallels between our own circumstance and the Mennonites of those days, where we've been able to very much do what we pleased. I think it's been progressively sort of ebbing away since, I'm not sure when the peak would have been, but there's been this some drive to maintain some of that cultural influence through things like political power and so forth. And I think that if you look at the pattern, you see that getting that power and allowing ourselves to maintain that ability to be left alone or to do what we want because we have the power, it's actually not super helpful for us.
Right. We see this picture painted in 19th century Russian Mennonites. But this is a universal problem across the entire history of the church, is that when we find ourselves in a place of comfort and ease, there tends to be a slipping away from holding on tightly to our faith and a close following of Jesus. And when we find ourselves in a place of persecution and hardship, well, you can see it today in the world. The places in the world where the church is under the deepest persecution are the places where the church is thriving and growing and energized and moving forward. In so many ways, North America, the Western world, has fallen away from the forefront of Christianity as these persecuted areas are literally picking up the cross and moving forward with the church.
Yeah, and we don't even need to get that anecdotal, though I agree with what you said, Jesse. I mean, I just look at my own life and I see this pattern, and I think that if we're all honest with ourselves, we probably see a similar thing. Like, when times are good and easy and comfortable, then that complacency often comes at the expense of a fire and a passion for our faith, and for living in a grateful obedience to what God has done for us. Like, this is very, very true. And I get a bit frustrated and upset, not just with others, but with myself, that we can have these stories and see the span of years and recognize that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I think we still struggle with how complacency can lead to spiritual apathy in our lives.
At the same time, part of the discussion here with Layton was that, does there really have to be a dichotomy? Something that the Mennonites sort of struggle to maintain. Does there really have to be a dichotomy between the ethics, the works, and then also like the joy and the freedom? And I think we know there doesn't have to be, but that doesn't make it necessarily easier to maintain.
There's this picture that he painted of the early Mennonites, or the Mennonites in this time period, as being able to hold both of those things together at their best, following Jesus in a serious way and caring a lot about doing it in the right ways and right practice, and then also having this joy and excitement and writing songs and celebrating. Right, there was a sort of celebratory nature to what they were doing doing. And this is something that, once again, it's maybe in some ways a human nature thing where we have a hard time holding these things together, these things that are meant to be together. That's maybe just a symptom of living in a broken world, is things that are intended to be joined get torn apart. And we see that in the fruit of the Spirit, right? The fruit of the Spirit has things that we associate with fun and excitement and passion, right? Love and joy and goodness and kindness and these things that are sort of very positive, warm things. But it's also got self-control, and it's got faithfulness, and it's got patience. These things in the Spirit are brought together in ways that we sometimes have trouble holding together in our own human heads and hearts.
And it's not just human nature in that. I think this is also, we're seeing the outcome of what happens when our faith starts to get jammed through this lens of just a set of rules or traditions to uphold. And then what happens when we become so rule-oriented is that we begin to express our faith with that which we are not allowed to do, right? Which is verboten. The things we can't do and the things we stand against. And then when we do that, then of course it comes across as no fun and lacking of joy. Really, when we rediscover all those things that are positive about being a follower of Jesus, when we start to redefine our faith about what we are called into and invited into that relationship and that love and that peace that passes all understanding, well, then I think that's one of the main paths forward to bringing these two things back together. But again, if we boil it down to rules, then Christianity becomes a list of do's and do nots. And then those do nots really make it seem no fun at all.
So we definitely can't escape from this sort of seesaw, or I should say our story, our thread of our discussion can't really seem to escape from the seesaw between faith works, faith works, faith works.
That's why we thought it was a good episode, I think, or sorry, a good season theme, is because you do get stuck on this seesaw a little bit, and it leaves you a lot to explore. There's a lot going on in this playground.
Yeah, and good thing by episode 4, we're not already second guessing our season topic.
Yeah, we said it all. We're actually kind of done.
The second line of questioning I pursued was how Kleine Gemeinde faith and practice has evolved since the early days, and how that balance between faith and works has shifted. Bear in mind that by 1874, the Kleine Gemeinde had migrated to Manitoba, and other groups of Mennonites and Anabaptists were also making their way to North America. We're moving away from the early influence of Luther and the Protestant Reformation toward the influence of American revivalism and evangelicalism. Darryl described the Kleine Gemeinde Mennonites of this time as essentially isolationists.
There's an expression that you might have heard, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure I'm saying it right, so your listeners might say, wow, that was butchered. But the phrase is stille im Lande. Stille im Lande. It means quiet in the land. And really, that's kind of it makes sense, but it's also a sad testimony, because they just wanted to live in peace. They just wanted to have their farms. They wanted to read their Bibles. They wanted to have their faith and then leave us alone. So on the one hand, they were pious, but on the other hand, they weren't evangelistic. So when they came to Canada, they chose places like Rosenort and Steinbach and even Winkler. We're not talking about Kleine Gemeinde, they didn't go to Winkler, but Mennonites would choose these far away places that they could live in isolation and still take their product to the market in Winnipeg. And so you can tell from that they were trying to create a community that was separate. In one sense, you can understand that they would want to be free from the influences of the world and not fall back into some of the problems of life in Russia, politics and war and all of that kind of thing. But on the other hand, they had forgotten the Great Commission.
The Kleine Gemeinde eventually changed its name to the Evangelical Mennonite Conference. It's got that word, evangelical, in the title. So when did it change? When did they move out of that isolation mentality?
It's a big story in a sense, and I'll try to summarize it as best I can. But around the 1920s, 1930s, there was a movement that's called evangelicalism. It replaced fundamentalism. Fundamentalism was a movement that arose to protect the church, the Christian church in North America in general, not just Mennonites, but everybody, to protect them from things like higher biblical criticism, the teaching of evolution, and many of these kinds of doctrines and philosophies. And so fundamentalism became a fortress mentality. Let's make sure that we keep things out. And so the church became known as what we're against. Evangelicalism arose out of that. And with that came the emphasis of the personal Christian life. Now, Dwight Moody and Billy Sunday had been preaching this for a while already, but it started to really gain momentum. And evangelicalism was, what is the church about? What's it for, rather than what's it against? And so evangelicalism was about the Bible, inerrancy of the Bible, and it was about being for Jesus and telling people about Jesus. And so this seeped into the Mennonite psyche in and around the 1920s and the 1930s. They started to get together. The young people would get together and they would have what they would call choir practice or Jugendfreund. And choir practice, but it was like a social occasion. The young people would get together, and even Bible studies started happening in those times. And so among the youth, there was this desire to know more about God. And I think that was partly the evangelical influence. And then about the 1930s, then you get Ben D. Reimer, he's been struck by this evangelical fervor and this personal relationship with Jesus. And here's this young Kleine Gemeinde guy who's getting excited about telling people about Jesus and even having an assurance of faith, which had never been taught among the Kleine Gemeinde, that you could know that you're saved. That was radical. And so as I understand the story, some men came to Ben D. Reimer while he was plowing a field and said, would you like to come teach at Steinbach Bible Institute? And he thought about it, and after a long while, he said yes, and he started teaching at the Bible Institute, and that's in the 1930s. I think it was late 1930s, and suddenly the Kleine Gemeinde started sending students to learn the Bible, to teach the Bible, to graduate with Bible degrees of some sort, and it just really started a movement, and it became a missional movement by the late 1940s. Into the 1950s. And so you start to see where the faith is awakening and the works start to match the faith.
We'll come back yet to learning more about the influence of the evangelicals on the Kleine Gemeinde, but I should quickly add that while American influence did actually help bring about some of this more evangelical bent, it came from American Mennonites, not the group that we would consider the sort of the main body of American evangelicalism. So I had to cut the clip for time, but one thing that talked a little bit about with, I think it was with Darryl, I might be getting my clips mixed up here, was that as society started opening up, I'm thinking mostly of the post-war era, kind of in that time period, then Mennonite society also kind of opened up a bit, sort of drawing a little bit on my historical knowledge. Post-war, the government's putting a lot into things like infrastructure. Phone lines are going out into the countryside. Electrical lines are going out into the countryside. Roads are so much better. And so the Kleine Gemeinde kind of couldn't stay as isolated as they were, even if they wanted to. So we have that. We also have like young people going into the city and getting jobs. And so the Kleine Gemeinde starts talking about, how do we do life as Mennonites when we're working as a bank teller or a teacher or something like that. It's in the same post-war era that they changed their name from the Kleine Gemeinde, the little flock or the little church, to the Evangelical Mennonite Church and then Evangelical Mennonite Conference, which illustrates a bit of a philosophy change in itself. You go from being this little church, kind of makes you think of insularity, to the Evangelical Mennonite Church. So the inherent in itself seems to be a bit of a big mindset shift.
Right. There's this move. It was fascinating to me to think through, some of the name changes that have happened for this group over the years, and thinking about themselves as the Kleine Gemeinde, the little church, or in Manitoba, thinking about themselves as the quiet in the land. And if Darryl was scared to try the Low German there, I'm not even going to give it an attempt. And what that means, right? How that characterizes the way that you think about faith and church and life when you give yourself a title like that, or when you have that title put on you, and then this move towards calling ourselves the Evangelical Mennonite Conference, which, you stack that up against Quiet in the Land, it feels like it's almost the opposite in some ways. Now we're speaking out about our faith and we're connecting with the world around us. And so it's fascinating to see the trajectory of my history in the name changes of this group as they kind of move through time.
And of course, the impact isn't in the name, right? The impact is in the movement or the passion or the fervor of whatever was happening within that group, that then the name just reflects that mentality. And I think we do see this transformation. And so whatever happened then in the 20s and the 30s to catch on to this evangelical fervor, I think still has shown up, and there's evidence of this today. It wasn't just a fad. It's not just a history note to be aware of. This is something that even as we look at the tremendous emphasis on missions that we have in the EMC and many other Anabaptist movements as well, this is clearly an outcome of being more outwardly focused, of being more missionally minded. And so, yeah, the movement that we're a part of now just has changed. And for many people, they would say changed for the better, or a more healthy approach to how we as Christ followers engage the world around us. But I think it's significant to know that changed the trajectory of the community, and we are still reaping some of the benefits of that as we continue to open mission fields across the world.
I feel like we could delve so much further into that, because there are still groups of Mennonites who are the quiet in the land, and they've had to find more isolated places to do that. So it really makes me, as a bit of a history buff, wonder, okay, where did the split happen? Why? And, I can make some guesses. But anyways, unfortunately, that is outside the scope of this episode.
No, it sounds like a bonus episode to me, Darryl.
Yeah. So we'll carry on with Layton. Layton has written about how Anabaptism has blended with or learned from evangelicalism and the positive effects that had on the Mennonites. So I asked him to flesh out how that affected the EMC's balance between faith and works.
There's a kind of recurring pattern in Anabaptist history over the last 500 years, actually, where Anabaptists who have emphasized the obedience and suffering and difficulty and grit and discipleship that is needed for the Christian faith. Take up your cross and follow Jesus. Anabaptists have lost their joy, have lost their sense of affection for Jesus. And it becomes a kind of really difficult, kind of grit your teeth, just grit your teeth and suffer kind of faith that eventually starts to feel like it has lost its heart. It becomes an external faith. It becomes very much about works. It becomes about conformity and so forth. So there's a recurring pattern where Mennonites fall into this kind of moralism. And that has had to be remedied, I think, with pietism in the late 1700s and then in the 1800s. And many Mennonites in Holland and Poland and in Russia were reading these pietist German writers. And so these are Baptists or Lutherans who have been affected by this renewal that's happening. And they're incredibly blessed by this. Like, it really actually brings out their Anabaptism in some ways. It's not seen in that sense as a compromise of Anabaptism. It's not seen as, kind of we're losing the cross to take up this emotional, bubbly faith. It's not really seen that way. It's actually seen as a renewal of their commitment to Jesus and their affection for Jesus. This happens in the 20th century again. And it happens first with evangelicalism. And so in Manitoba, at least, and in other parts of Canada, Kleine Gemeinde Mennonites begin to interact much more with their evangelical neighbors in the 1940s and the 1950s. And they begin to see in evangelicalism, which is itself going through a renewal at that time. The 1950s was a big boom time for evangelicals in Canada. But they begin to be affected by the emphasis on assurance of salvation, on the fact that you can know that you are saved, that you can have joy, that you can believe in the gospel, and that you have something good to share. It's a very confident faith. It's one that gets you out of your little town or little village and gets you out into the world to communicate the gospel to other people. It's really attractive to Mennonites who have become disillusioned with some of their traditions and some of the legalism that they feel has crept into their faith again. And so this brings an incredible renewal, actually, to the Kleine Gemeinde faith in the 1940s and 50s. And this results in what is today our EMC missions program, our church planting program. This is where this begins. We get this confidence that we can actually change the world. We can get out there and do stuff. We can communicate the gospel, and it's infectious and it's good. And so that happens. I think another time where that happens is probably even more recently, where we have borrowed a lot from the Pentecostal tradition. I think that comes a little bit later, maybe 1980s and 1990s, where we have a lot of connection with Pentecostal churches. Actually, a lot of EMC Mennonites leave their churches in the 1980s and the 1990s to join Pentecostal churches that are starting around them. And so that becomes a bit of a competition, but ultimately the blessing returns, so to speak, and many Mennonite churches today have a faith that's quite influenced by Pentecostal forms of worship and thought. Much more openness to healing, miracles, much more emotional worship, the use of worship bands, all of this. These are ways that we've learned. These are things we've learned from our Pentecostal brothers and sisters. And so all the way along, like we've always borrowed from people that help us get back our joy, I think is the way I would put it. Get back this kind of contagious understanding of grace, of assurance, of love, and so forth. That is, I think, quite in keeping with the original Anabaptist vision.
So it's clear that there's tons and tons and tons that we can't get into in this podcast. There's so much history here that I would really like to know, like more about the influence of the Pentecostals and the Charismatics in the 80s and so forth. We just don't have the time.
Yeah.
Just don't have the time.
We have the time. I don't think our listeners have the time. They're almost to work now. We better wrap it up.
Gotta land the plane.
Yeah. No, I think in the big picture, if we can try and sum it up simply, one of the things that I felt really clearly through this is it was fascinating to see how the Mennonite Church and the EMC specifically, kind of our background, how they were enhanced and revitalized and re-energized by external sources, right? By other parts of the church, and learning and borrowing from and taking on aspects of some of the other movements that were around them. And I think there's a lesson there about sort of having curiosity and humility when it comes to how we think about doing church. And there's that whole isolationism versus sort of engagement and community thing there as well. I think being open to the streams around us in the larger, I was going to say Catholic in the other way, but that wouldn't that would just be confusing.
Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right on a lot of that, Jesse. And just to be reminded that that we ought not to be overly skeptical or to think that we've arrived at our own conclusion. I think, being firm and confident in what we believe and what some of the pillars of our movement are doesn't mean that we are done learning or growing or re-engaging our faith. And so just to be open to continue to learn. And I think even on a podcast like this, I think it's important to have some good Anabaptist voices. We also have some people contributing from outside of our tradition, and that's all in the same vein, to continue to be challenged, to continue to grow, and to continue to thrive in our relationship with Jesus together.
The Armchair Anabaptist is a podcast of the Evangelical Mennonite Conference.
You can check us out online at www.thearmchairanabaptist.ca and find us on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are found.
A special thanks to our guests who joined us today. Those were Darryl Klassen and Layton Friesen.
Our executive producer is Erica Fair, our audio engineer is Chris Askoff, and our administrative assistant is Ruth Block. I'm Jesse Penner.
I'm Andrew Dick.
And I'm Geraldine Witchers, and we have been your hosts for the Armchair Anabaptist. We certainly hope that what you have heard today will do more than just stay as merely food for thought, but will help inspire each of us to get up out of the comfort of our armchairs and translate into living more like Jesus.
Join us next episode as we talk about the relationship between good works and good results in an episode titled Health, Wealth, and Holy Misconceptions.
That's next time on the Armchair Anabaptist.